Hello, everyone. I am Celeste Rodriguez Louro. I am live, ao vivo, from the University of Western Australia in Perth, Western Australia. I would like to acknowledge the Noongar people who are the owners of the lands on which the University of Western Australia stands. I would like to pay my respects to their elders, leaders, and communities. I would also like to acknowledge the First Nations people of all the lands on which we live and work. It is really exciting to be here today. Abralin ao Vivo, Linguists Online, is an innovative event run by the Brazilian Linguistics Association in collaboration with many linguistic societies and groups, some of which include la Associación de Lingüística y Filología la Asociación de Lingüística y Filología de América Latina, la Sociedad Argentina de Estudios Lingüísticos, the Linguistic Society of America, the Linguistics Association of Great Britain, and the Australian Linguistic Society. The event is designed to give students and researchers free access to state-of-the-art discussions on diverse topics related to the study of human language during the pandemic. Abralin ao Vivo has been a bright light during such difficult times. We acknowledge these difficulties and stand in solidarity with all those facing all sorts of challenges. It hasn't been easy. As anthropologist Anand Pandian has argued recently, the pandemic is a portal, and Abralin and its president Miguel Oliveira Jr. have created a one-of-a-kind opportunity for us all to come together, to continue to grow intellectually. Abralin has also shown us that we can still get together, opening doors to new and exciting ways of doing things. Today, I am so pleased to be able to bring to you a very special panel. We have been running Language Variation and Change Australia every 2 years since 2013. Catherine Travis, who is one of our panelists today, and I were part of the initial team, together with Adam Shembri, now at the University of Birmingham. More recently, James Walker, also here with us today, has come on board as an organizer. Today, we will discuss some of the insights and discoveries that we have come across doing sociolinguistic research in Australia. Research that has taken place across a range of geographical and social contexts. Research into language varieties as diverse as standardized Australian English, multicultural Australian English, Aboriginal English, as well as ancestral Indigenous languages spoken in Northern Australia. So during this journey across and around the continent, we will focus on some of the historical, cultural, and social features that have made sociolinguistic research in Australia unique, and on the ways that our discoveries have pushed the envelope and expanded traditional practice. We will take some questions at the end, and we will discuss the future of sociolinguistics in Australia as we enter a new decade. Today, we are joined by Professor Catherine Travis from the Australian National University, Dr. John Mansfield from the University of Melbourne, Professor James Walker from La Trobe University, and Professor Gerry Docherty from Griffith University. We also have Dr. Ksenia Gnesheva of the Australian National University moderating the chat. Please feel very free to ask questions. We will bring some of these back to the panel for discussion towards the end. I would like to begin our conversation today with Professor Catherine Travis. Catherine is Professor of Modern European Languages at the Australian National University and Chief Investigator in the ARC Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language. She completed her PhD at La Trobe University and then spent 10 years at the University of New Mexico, working on variation and change in a long-standing Spanish-English bilingual community in collaboration with Rena Torres Caucoles. She returned to Australia in 2012 and is now running a large-scale variationist sociolinguistic project in Sydney. The project has a great name, Sydney Speaks. Catherine, What have been some of the main discoveries in the context of your Sydney Speaks project?
Thanks, Celeste, and thanks very much, Abralin, for giving us this opportunity to come and talk from Australia. So one of the things that we've been observing has been the enigmatic nature of ethnolects or multicultural voices that you mentioned in the introduction, Celeste. And another issue that we've been probing has been the role of ethnic minorities in leading change. So today I want to talk about some of the work that we've been doing in Sydney Speaks, exploring ethnolects and ethnic variation in the community over time and trying to probe these issues a little bit more. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the team of Sydney Speaks, and in particular, James Grummer and Simon Gonzalez, who have led the sociophonetic work that I'm going to be presenting. So today you're going to be taken on a bit of a tour across different cities in Australia, and my research is focusing in Sydney. Sydney is an ideal city in which to study the role of ethnic minorities in variation and change. On the one hand, it's a very diverse city. Of its 5 million people, around 36% report to speak a language other than English at home. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the iconic Opera House, but you're probably less familiar with some of these scenes of multicultural Sydney, which reflect some of the larger migrant groups, including migrants of Chinese, Vietnamese, Italian, and Greek background. Another reason why Sydney is a really great location in which to study ethnic variation is because it was the locus of one of the earliest studies of the role of ethnic minorities in variation in the seminal work of Barbara Horvath, conducted in the 1980s primarily. And this, because of the work that Horvath has done, means that we're in the unique situation of being able to study the role of ethnic minorities in change in real time. So in Sydney Speaks, we're putting together a large corpus of sociolinguistic interviews, and we're using the data that Horvath collected, recorded in the late 1970s, early 1980s, to form the Sydney Social Dialect Survey. This included adults born in the 1930s and teenagers born in the 1960s. And we're adding to that the Sydney Speaks data that we're currently collecting, which includes adults also born in the 1960s, so the same generation as Horvath's teenagers, but recorded now 40 years on, and young adults born in the 1990s. So this gives us then 4 time points in which we can study change in real and apparent time. The data that I'm going to be presenting today comes from approximately 100 hours or 1 million words of speech taken from sociolinguistic interviews and recording 197 participants. The participants are all native speakers of Australian English. They all grew up in Australia and they're of different ethnic backgrounds. So we include Australians of Anglo-Celtic background, but also second generation migrants of Greek, Italian and Chinese background. And the migrant groups that are represented in each of these 4 time points is slightly different according to the migration histories and also according to the progress of data collection. I'm going to present very, very briefly some results on 2 linguistic features, a set of Australian English vowels and word final ER. And we'll begin with these 5 Australian English diphthongs: fleece, face, price, mouth and goat. These vowels are particularly interesting from this perspective. For one reason, they have traditionally demonstrated variation along a socio-stylistic continuum that has been used to define Australian English vowels, referred to as the broad, general, cultivated continuum. They've also been shown to be have undergone substantial change over time. And of particular interest to us here is Horvath's finding that the Greek and Italian teenagers that she recorded in the 1970s were leading a change at that time towards more general Australian English vowel realizations. And she argued that they were doing this in an effort to sound Australian, to maximally differentiate themselves from their accented parents, who were situated more at the broad and cultivated ends of the continuum. In our work, consistent with this, we're observing a movement away from broad variance, which we can categorise socially as a move away from male working class realisations. So here's an illustration of the change that we're observing in the Sydney Speaks data, looking just at Anglos for now and comparing the oldest time group that we have represented, the 1970s adults, they're in light blue, and the youngest time group, which is the 2010s young adults, in dark blue, and just looking at the vowel fleece. And here we can see that indeed there has been substantial change over time. And I'm going to play you two examples in which I hope you can hear quite clearly the difference. So here's an example from a 1970s adult.
I worked in a cheese factory. I worked in a cheese factory.
And here's a 2010s young adult.
When I was 14, I used to change dates on cheese.
So clearly a substantial change has taken place among the Anglo community. So focusing just on the 2010s young adults, where do the different ethnic groups sit within that? Firstly, the Italians, added here in yellow, you can see that they are very, very close to their age cohort, their Anglo age cohort, nearly identical, in fact. The Chinese, however, while they're in that same general space of the 2010s young adult vowel pronunciations as compared to the 1970s adult, they are somewhat different. And in fact, we can categorize this as them being ahead in this change that we're observing. And here's an example to illustrate that.
My kids will probably speak better Chinese than I will.
Yeah.
My kids will probably speak better Chinese than I will.
Yeah.
Okay, so for fleece then we see this difference with the Chinese being slightly ahead. What do we see for the other vowels? Here's the set of the 5 diphthongs. And in fact, we observe a very similar pattern for each of these diphthongs. For each of them, the Chinese are similar to the Anglos and the Italians in that same general space, but just slightly ahead. And in fact, for fleece, face, and mouth, they are significantly ahead of that change. So to summarize what we see here then is that we see an overall shared vocalic system across these 2010s young adults for the Anglo, Italian and Chinese Australians. And this is consistent with what's been found for these same migrant groups in different varieties in North America. But we're also seeing here that Chinese Australians are at the leading edge of this change. We can interpret this as them producing realizations that are furthest from what were traditionally associated with male working class. And this is entirely consistent with the social position of second generation Chinese migrants in Australia, who tend to be very well educated. They tend to work in high status professions and they tend to live in wealthier suburbs in Sydney. So what we see here then is with these Chinese Australians, rather than orienting towards their ethnic background, their vowel pronunciations reflect an orientation to overtly prestigious norms associated with middle class Australia, which is precisely where they sit also socially. And so we can interpret this as their way of trying to sound Australian, to use Horvath's wording. What do we see then for ER, which is slightly different? So word final ER is a variable that has been of some interest in Australia. It's variably pronounced, and it has been described as a salient ethnolectal feature in Australia. Klein and colleagues described it as one of the most conspicuous phonological features of the Greek ethnolect. And Kiesling, in acoustic work, identified that young Greek Australians were tending to use a longer and backer variant. And here's an example from a Greek Australian teenager from the 1970s, where hopefully you can hear this longer variant.
Well, we used to sort of play with cards. We used to have a murderer, and that was represented by a joker.
All right, so this is what we see then in the Sydney Speaks data over time. I'm focusing here just on the change in terms of duration, broken down for each of the 4 time points, and at each time point, in the different colour, we have the different ethnicities that are represented at that time point. And the higher the bar, the longer the duration of ER. So what we can see here looking at the 1970s teens is that the Greek teenagers were indeed longer than both the Anglo and the Italian teenagers. And this is precisely the ethnolectal difference that Klein and Kiesling were observing. When we contextualize this over time, we can see that there has been a lengthening across the community over time, such that today the Anglo-Australians and Italian and Chinese Australians are producing ER of a similar duration to that which the Greeks were producing in the 1970s, the Anglos being just even slightly longer. And here's an example of a young adult Anglo-Australian in which you can hear this.
If I do 5 now, 5
next semester I'll do 2 over summer.
So what we observe with this variable then is what was once an ethnolectal feature has moved away from that ethnolectal notion and has been adopted more widely across the community, and in particular by Anglo-Australians. What we're seeing then is various instances of ethnic minorities leading in language change, and we can think about why this might be happening. One point is that it appears that they may be making use of features undergoing change to mark their difference, as has been proposed in Sweden in work by Gross and colleagues. So they're not necessarily drawing on features associated with their ethnic identity in doing this, but they're drawing on features of variation that are available in the wider community. This is consistent to some degree with Horvath's proposal that they may be early adopters of change, in this case, in order to sound Australian. And in relation to this, we could also observe that the ethnic minorities may have less access to an adult model because in home, the parents aren't speaking, in our case, Australian English, they're speaking either another language or accented Australian English. And also important, I think, is Cheshire and colleagues' observation that ethnic minorities may have more diverse social networks, and this may then facilitate the spread of innovations across the community. So then to think in the bigger picture about ethnolex and ethnic variation in the community over time and the enigmatic nature of ethnolex that I mentioned at the beginning, I think it's worthwhile drawing here on Eckert's observation, which we would wholeheartedly support, that there's no obvious way to distinguish between a dialect with ethnic features and an ethnolect. And we would argue that patterns of ethnic variation can best be interpreted when contextualized in relation to variation and change in the broader community. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. I would now like to introduce Dr. John Mansfield. John is an Australian Research Council Fellow and lecturer in linguistics at the University of Melbourne. He has done field research on Australian Indigenous languages spoken in Northern Australia and has been the first sociolinguist to document patterns of variation and change in these languages. He is particularly interested in the types of linguistic structure that can be sites of social indexicality. John, what has been your biggest aha moment in doing sociolinguistic research in remote Australia and with Indigenous Australian languages and communities?
Thank you, Celeste. I think I'd pick as my biggest aha moment when I finally understood the meaning of the letter K with regards to social stance taking. So I'll come to that in a few minutes. I'll start by trying to put my slides up. I hope everyone can see this and will let me know if they can't. So what gets me really excited about variationist research in Australia and in our region more broadly is just the diversity of linguistic variation, the diversity of types of things that can vary and the kinds of social functions they can serve. So the first question I ever set myself in linguistics was to try and find out what youth slang would be like in an Australian Aboriginal language. And doing this led me to William Labov and led me thereof to language variation and change literature, which I found riveting. But what I also found riveting was thinking about how these kinds of language variation and change might play out in different types of languages with different types of linguistic structures, both phonologically and grammatically, and also how sociolinguistic variation may play out in very different kinds of social contexts, especially contexts, non-urban contexts, different kinds of Indigenous societies around the world. So by drawing these things together, what I was really doing was taking a language variation and change approach and trying to combine it with linguistic typology, i.e. an interest in diversity of linguistic structures. And typology itself is also very inherently interested in how languages change, because to understand how we end up with such a diverse range of linguistic structures, we have to understand the processes of change that got us there. So it's this overlap between language variation and change and typology that I find particularly exciting to work in. It's and it's also, I'd like to highlight today, being great in terms of cross-cultural working relationships.
Slides. Sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your slides. So would you like to try?
Thanks for letting me know.
Yeah, no worries.
All right. How about now?
I still can't see them.
All right, wait a sec.
I mean, we can continue without them, but just letting you know.
Yep, one moment. How about this one? How
Yes.
about now?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. All righty. So this slide shows what I just said. So trying to look at this combination of language variation and change with a linguistic typology perspective and the diversity of types of linguistic variation we might find. So I'll start with a fairly simple example. I started doing field research on the Murrin Pata language of Northern Australia. So this is one of the vibrant Australian Aboriginal languages. It's still spoken as the main language in some towns in Northern Australia. It's the first language learnt by children in that area. It has about 3,000 speakers. So I was doing fieldwork on Murrin Pata, and one of the things I started to notice was that I was working mostly with young men, and their pronunciations were rather different from what had been documented. In particular, there was a lot of lenition going on. And on further investigation, I started to narrow this down to being mostly the P and K stop consonants, which were being lenited, and mostly at the beginning of words. So rather than pronouncing pata, young men would often say fata, and rather than saying kardu, young men would often say hardu. So I ran a variationist study on this, and at least in a careful speech setting, this showed that young men were indeed producing these lenited variants much more frequently than old men. Now, so what I found really interesting about this is it showed a kind of phonetic variation, a lenition variable. As is perhaps expected, young people were doing it more than older people, but the kind of phonological context was interestingly different from some previous studies. So if you think of it in comparison to T flapping in American English, or word final S lenition in Spanish, we see different kind of consonants being targeted here and in a different position in the word. And what's even more interesting about this is it actually reflects Australian phonologies in a very interesting way, because in historical phonological terms, a very common thing happening in Australian phonologies has been lenition and deletion of initial consonants. So this suggests that synchronic linguistic variation observed in Murrin Pata may reflect something about the whole language family or kind of phonological typology of the region. And I'd just like to acknowledge, so I mentioned about the kind of cross-cultural working relationships. I'd like to acknowledge Gerry, who is particularly important in teaching me Murrin Pata during this study, helping me learn about youth language and about youth subculture. So moving on to something else here that's in the grammar and at the other end of the demographic scale. This variant is particularly interesting in relationship to seniority and authority in Murrin Pata culture. And this is the meaning of the K that I was talking about. So in Murrin Pata third singular verbs, as you can see 3 examples here, the initial consonant can be alternated with a K consonant, such as instead of saying dim, you can say kem, or instead of wuran, you can say kuran, or instead of dempindut, you can say kempindut. And this was quite enigmatic. And for a long time, I was trying to find the meaning of this K alternation and looking for it in kind of referential semantic terms. But the aha moment came when I realized through reading other people's research that it's not about the meaning, it's about the social action and stance taking that's going on. when you use these K forms of the verb, you're asserting your epistemic authority in an interaction. So this one little example shows you two speakers, and the first is saying, give me some water. And the other says, oh, but the thing, then she says, hold it for me. I got some water for them. And then she says, no, there is no water here. And she holds out the empty bottle to show that it's empty. Now it's in that final utterance when she uses this K form of the verb, because she's having to assert, I know more about this than you do. That's what I call epistemic authority. It's when the speaker is taking a stance of asserting that I know more about this than you, my addressee. So I then started looking at how this K verb forms were playing out in all the recordings I'd made and in other people's recordings. And a couple of very interesting things came to light. One was the K forms were much more common in one particular speech genre, which is dreaming stories. So dreaming stories are a culturally specific speech genre where they're sacred stories which you inherit and which talk about kind of very essential spiritual matters, connections to the land, stories of how things came to be. So people were using these K forms much more frequently when telling these narratives. And this is very interesting because dreaming stories are so connected with your right to know. You can only tell a dreaming story if you have the inherited right to tell that story. And people are very careful and cautious about this. So it kind of makes sense that people would be using this verb form and taking this stance more in that kind of speech. But the other very interesting thing I found was that older people were using these K forms more frequently than younger people, and doing so in all kinds of speech, all kinds of quite prosaic, even kind of linguistic elicitation speech. But it came up most strongly in some dyadic recordings I made where there were older people speaking with a younger relative. And in these situations, the older person was using the K form much more than the younger person. So I think of this as something like old-splaining. So in comparison to mansplaining that's been observed in English language interaction, where men habitually take up this stance of epistemic authority, especially when addressing women, due to some cultural ideas they have about masculinity and knowledge. What we see instead in Murrumbidgee is old people habitually taking up this stance of epistemic authority due to perhaps some different cultural ideas about where knowledge lies and the right to know things. And I'd like to acknowledge Wanbu, who's been my most senior teacher and really has been an honor to learn from. And it's been an honor to be old-splained at by Wanbu on many an occasion. So to wrap up, I've sketched some of the dimensions of diversity that we find when we look at sociolinguistic variation in an Australian Aboriginal language. So looking at a Lanician variable, the phonological structure of the variable is different from Lanician variables observed in some other languages. Also grammatical structures. So we're looking at a very different kind of variable here. It's an epistemic morphology variable, which turns out to have relationships to demographics and social identities and kinds of interaction. So doing these studies just brushes the surface really of a just fascinating field of diversity in social identities, speech genres, cultural epistemologies, people's ideas of who can know what and how we can negotiate that in interaction. And the last person I'd like to acknowledge as a very important collaborator, especially in the recent years, has been Nguvudir, who has just taken my Murrumbidgee learning to a whole other level and given me just even further insights into Murrumbidgee culture and people's life worlds. So I'll wrap up there and hand back to you, Celeste, if I may unshare. Did I unshare my screen? Stop sharing.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Do you want to swap over now for introductions?
Yes, all right, I'll keep going and introduce you. So Celeste Rodriguez Louro is Senior Lecturer and Australian Research Council DECRA Fellow in Linguistics at the University of Western Australia. She holds a BA in English from the Universidad Nacional de Mar del Plata in Argentina, an MA in Hispanic Linguistics from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and a PhD in Linguistics from the University of Melbourne. Celeste is currently working in collaboration with Glenys Collard on an externally funded project examining Aboriginal English in the Perth metropolitan area. Celeste, would you like to tell us about some of the ways your current research has forced you to expand your sociolinguistic practice?
Thank you, John. I will now share my screen, and if someone could let me know whether you can see this, that would be good.
Success.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you, John, once again. Yes, we are working on Aboriginal English, and this is work that, as John was saying, I am lucky to be able to do with Glenys Collard. I'll introduce you to Glenys in a moment, but first, let's just look at what exactly Aboriginal English is. Aboriginal English is a contact variety spoken by an estimated 80% of Indigenous people in Australia. It is used for distinctive speech acts, speech events, and genres. It is usually placed on a continuum ranging from acrolectal to basilectal varieties. This here is a photo of Glenys Collard, shared with permission, as are all photos and videos shown here today. Glenys is a Southwest Noongar woman who has been working on projects concerning Aboriginal English for over 30 years. She is my partner in the research I am about to share with you all. As you may know, I am originally from Argentina and only migrated to Australia in my late 20s. So you may imagine what an honor it was for me to meet Glenys Collard and to have the opportunity to work closely with her. I am really, really grateful. Working together with Glenys allowed me to reconsider the way that things like data collection have traditionally been done in sociolinguistics, and her expertise made it possible to approach the research in exciting and innovative ways. The issues I will be describing today emerged in the context of our cross-cultural research. The experiences I will share with you are related to an Australian Research Council DECRA project that is exploring language variation and change in storytelling. One of the crucial questions in this project is, have speakers of Aboriginal English adopted some of the global linguistic innovations that have reconfigured the quotative system of inner circle Englishes? And if so, in what context and under what conditions? To be able to answer this question, we needed a corpus of naturalistic interaction. When a variationist sociolinguist needs a corpus of naturalistic interaction, the first thing they are likely to devise is a sociolinguistic interview. However, it soon became clear that that was not going to work, and I will come back to this point a little bit later. So let's talk briefly about why the sociolinguistic interview is so important in sociolinguistic research. It is so popular because it is a controlled way of obtaining data that is seen as resembling naturalistic interaction. And sociolinguists don't just value it because it's tried and tested. The sociolinguistic interview is based on Lebov's model of style shifting. For Lebov, style shifting depends on the amount of attention a person pays to their own speech. This is nicely summarized in Lebov's definition that styles may be arranged along a single dimension measured by the amount of attention paid to speech. The idea is to elicit various degrees of awareness, with narratives demanding minimal attention to speech and allowing vernacular language to emerge. So the assumption is that the more emotionally engaged someone is with the content rather than with the mechanics of producing sounds and grammar and putting the story together, the more likely they'll give us an insight into their vernacular language use, or what Devyani Sharma has recently referred to as the real me. The sociolinguistic interview has been modified to suit a variety of situations, but, and I'm quoting here, it remains the most important item in the variationist sociolinguists toolkit. So in early 2019, Glenys and I prepared to go out in the field, and I showed up with a potential sociolinguistic interview, including what I thought were some quote unquote culturally sensitive questions. Glenys, however, was not sure this was going to work in her community. And on further reflection, she says, I would be ashamed to use a questionnaire on my people. So she would be embarrassed to ask people a series of questions because in her community, people are not 100% okay with being put on the spot. So how could we collect the data that we needed? Because we were making decisions as a cross-cultural team, we decided to take Glenys's leadership and use yarning as a data collection tool. And you can see Glenys here yarning with a variety of people in people's homes, in the streets, and in city parks. Glenys was always there for her people, listening, sitting with them, hearing the voices. But what is yarning? It is an Indigenous cultural form of storytelling and conversation. It's been defined as a process of making meaning, communicating and passing on history and knowledge. Here we can see yarning as illustrated by Glenys Collard herself, where yarning is at the center, and importantly, it is framed as a key way to transfer knowledge. So what did we end up with as a result of using yarning in the field? The subset of the corpus we're focusing on here is on the acrolectal, on the lighter end of the spectrum, and it contains 25 hours of video recorded data with 40, 18 to 90-year-old speakers of Noongar ancestry, for whom Aboriginal English is their underlying vernacular, all the lect emerging automatically and unthinkingly, to use Leboff's own terms. All the stories in our corpus deal with Aboriginal accounts of Aboriginal stories. They are teeming with what Leboff has famously labelled the language of life and death. Throughout the corpus, two themes are recurrent: spirit yarns and death, including the loss of young Aboriginal lives through tragic accidents and death in custody. Let's have a look at a story from our corpus so you can hear it for yourself. The narrative episode you're about to hear is part of a longer sequence of episodes in which the White Lady, a Noongar spirit woman, foretells the death of a child. Here we are focusing on the language of the female speaker. This type of yarn, where the appearance of a Noongar spirit person foretells the death of a young person in their community, is not an isolated instance in our corpus. There is at least one other narrative told by an 18-year-old woman where the death of a young Aboriginal person is preceded by the appearance of a Noongar spirit man, to use her own terms. In all cases, the stories are rich in vernacular features, such as the use of quotative verbs to include constructed dialogue, frames such as say, think, and the zero quotative.
Anyway, she was holding me there, holding me so hard too. Oh my God, I said, we must, this old Noongar lady was trying to give me a message, I said, about something. What, she said, because she grabbed me and held me tighter like, and I got up to cry, and she cried, what, sister, what happened? I said, something took us to the bush, I said, way over here. Where? Show me, she said, because we didn't know. Show me, sister, show me. So I'm walking in front of her, and she's crying, and I'm crying too, over the other side of that camp. And I'm walking along, and I'm scared too. And she's crying, and, oh, where? Show me, sister, lead me. Where you went? I'm walking along. Well, I got to read you away again. I couldn't move any further, and I couldn't tell her that, no, I couldn't go any further. She grabbed me again. She said, look, if you went a little bit further, that's where we found our little girl in the middle of the night. Sister, if you'd have went a little bit further there, you'd have found our little girl. I said, no, something stopped me. Something wouldn't let me go any further there. Something evil was there, something it was. It wouldn't let me go near there. Anyway, she grabbed me again. Look, my little girl, that's where we found at 12 o'clock in the night. They had fire sticks and all burning to find her. And she was sitting crying there in the night.
So as you can see, there isn't a need for a sociolinguistic interview, not even a culturally appropriate one, if one can call it that, in a project that needs a corpus of stories, because yarning is a goldmine for the types of talk and interaction and narrative data needed for productive sociolinguistic research, at least in the context of our own project. What we have discovered in our work is that yarning made it possible to record speakers' vernacular without putting people on the spot, simply by drawing on existing communicative practice in the community. So let's wrap up, because we are running out of time. Yarning works as a means to collect vernacular language, that's for sure, but we would like to think that our contribution transcends this. Early this century, sociolinguist Carmen Ford advocated for variationist research into minority language communities, arguing that extreme attention to mainstream white communities was causing findings from these groups to become the norm. Our project offers a novel way of doing sociolinguistic research in minority communities by drawing on Indigenous communicative practice. Here we have argued that the best way to conduct sociolinguistic fieldwork is not to make an existing tool such as the sociolinguistic interview culturally appropriate, but to draw on existing culturally appropriate ways of communicating. Working under Indigenous leadership made it possible for us to make the most of preferred modes of interaction, rather than impose a so-called tried and tested method that has worked in predominantly white settings. Variationist theory is very much still driving the general research questions in our project, but we are suggesting that yarning makes it possible to expand our toolkit in a productive way. Thank you. So I will now return to my, can you see me now, or can you see my slides? Could anyone? Yes, I can see some nodding. That's good. So our next speaker is James Walker. James is Professor of Language Diversity at La Trobe University in Melbourne. He did his PhD under the supervision of Shana Poplak. James arrived in Australia in 2017 after 17 years at York University in Toronto. James, what have been some of the big insights emerging from your research?
Thanks, Celeste. First of all, I'd like to thank Celeste for organizing this panel. Eu quero também agradecer a Abralin para a oportunidade de falar. Eu vou falar em inglês, mas se tiverem perguntas em português, eu posso provar a responder. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about my interest in ethnolex and heritage language maintenance in Melbourne and how it compares with other cities such as Sydney, Toronto, and London. And I'd also like to talk a little bit about the future of variationist research in Australia, combining variationist research with traditional description documentation of Indigenous Australian languages and languages of the Asia Pacific region. So I'll just share my screen with you. Can you see that? Okay. As Celeste mentioned, I was for the last 17 years at York University in Toronto, and research project I've been working on there since about 2004, 2005 with my colleague Nicole Hoffman was looking at the question of ethnolects, or ethnically marked ways of speaking a majority language. And I'm greatly indebted to the late Michael Klein, who was in Melbourne, who did a lot of research on this the 1990s and early 2000s. A lot of this work, though, focused on salient features of English, and in Catherine's presentation, you saw some examples of these salient features. In the work that we did in Toronto, we found that there were differences across groups, but that the differences were fairly superficial, so that even though we saw differences in overall rates of use of some of these salient features, it obscured the fact that the speakers shared an underlying linguistic system. The other thing that we found was that many of the non-salient features were also important. So not simply the things that people notice, but to look at the entire linguistic system as a whole. And there we also found some differences. We also found it was important to sample not just speakers of the ethnically marked groups, but also to sample speakers of the ethnically unmarked groups, so speakers of the majority language, in order to have a proper basis of comparison. So one of my motivations in moving to Melbourne a few years ago was to focus on the question of ethno-linguistic variation in Melbourne. Melbourne is similar to Toronto in a number of ways. It doesn't feature the same degree of ethno-linguistic variation, but it does feature a fair bit of linguistic diversity. This is a map taken from the 2011 Census of Australia, where you can see concentrations of speakers of different language backgrounds in different parts of the city. I hesitate to call these enclaves the same way that we would in Toronto, because the percentage of the speakers in these areas is not quite as high as it is in Toronto, but there are areas of Melbourne where you can go where they are recognizably represented by people of different ethno-linguistic backgrounds. So the largest groups, as you can see here, are Chinese as in red, Greek as in a light blue, Italian as in dark blue, Vietnamese in this salmon color, and various other groups. So a long-term project that I've been developing in collaboration with Gerry Docherty, who you'll hear from shortly, as well as with colleagues at the University of Melbourne, is to go into these communities and to conduct sociolinguistic interview with local people doing the interviews to get a sense of what interaction among people from these various backgrounds would be like. Not only in the English that they speak, but also in terms of the maintenance of the heritage languages. So I have two potential PhD students who are unfortunately stuck in China at the moment because of the coronavirus situation. But I'm also working with Steffi Nicolotis at La Trobe University to digitize some older recordings in Greek and to collect further data in Greek. Another project that I've been engaged with in collaboration with Cara Penry-Williams, which we're partway through, is to collect sample from the traditional Anglo-Celtic population. So if these different neighborhoods that you can see here representing the different colors show the diversity, we also wanted to get samples from the gray areas where there's low levels of ethno-linguistic diversity. So we identified two neighborhoods in Melbourne, one in the northeast, which is Diamond Creek, which is solidly middle class, and one in the southeast, which is Frankston, which is very working class. So we're trying to get a representation of the old line Anglo-Celtic population to compare with the data that we collect from these other communities. So we're currently in the process of analyzing the data from the Anglo-Celtic population, and we should have some preliminary results on that soon. The other thing I want to talk about is the future of variationist research in Australia. You've heard a little bit about this from John. So Australian linguistics has a long history of language documentation, primarily of Indigenous Australian languages, but also languages of the Asia-Pacific region. And there's a lot of movement in terms of the area of language revitalization. To just give you a map from the Paradisec website, which is a repository of fieldwork data collected by Australian researchers in various places around the world, you can see that there's a concentration there in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that what's interesting for me in terms of my arrival in Australia is to engage further in variationist research on these different languages. So you heard already from John Mansfield about work on Australian Indigenous languages. There's also work that Jonathan Lum has been doing with languages from the Solomon Islands. And more recently, Marie-France Diamel just defended her thesis at ANU, looking at languages in Vanuatu using variationist research. So this is another area of future research in variationist research that I see happening in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Our last speaker today is Gerry Docherty. Gerry is professor in the Griffith University Centre for Social and Cultural Research in Brisbane. Gerry received a PhD in phonetics from the linguistics department at the University of Edinburgh in 1989. He spent a large part of his career at Newcastle University in the north of England, developing a string of work on sociophonetic variability, with a focus on fine-grained phonetic detail. He moved to Australia in 2013 and has been Dean Research at Griffith University since then. He is also currently working on an ASC-funded project looking at sociophonetic variability in the conversational speech of young people from Perth. Gerry, what have been some of the biggest discoveries for you in your research?
Thanks very much, Celeste. Thanks for organising this great event, and thanks to my other colleagues for that fantastic snapshot of their work. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands where I'm sitting here today, overlooking the Brisbane River, the Yagara and the Terrible people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people. To round off our presentations then, I'm going to flip back to the topic of sociophonetics for a few minutes. And firstly, I'll give a bit of context. I think it's really remarkable that in the last decade, there's been a huge growth of interest in sociophonetic research on varieties of English spoken in Australia. We've already heard about some of this work in the presentation given by Catherine earlier. I think there are two main factors that are associated with this sudden growth. First, there's been a general move away from what was the previously widely used classification of English accents in Australia, devised by Mitchell and Delbridge in 1964. This set out to capture phonetic variation across speakers of Australian English by locating their accent along a socio-stylistic continuum, with anchor broad, with accents differentiated largely in terms of the realization of a subset of vowel categories. This classification was really quite groundbreaking for its time, and based on Mitchell and Delbridge's fantastically rich database of 7,000 plus students recorded in over 300 schools right across the continent. And the classification prevailed for around 40 years into the late 1990s and early 2000s. But I think it increasingly came into conflict with the realization that the sociophonetic landscape in Australia is significantly more complex than could be captured by a single dimension, and is strongly shaped by variegation in the social and cultural makeup of the population, particularly in the large urban centres where most of that population lives. So from this stems the growing interest in investigating phonetic variation, not only as a function of ethnicity, but also gender, age, situation, and other social factors. And also as a function of geography. It's often commented that English pronunciation doesn't vary hugely across this huge continent, with strong connecting forces existing between the major population centres that militate against the effects of geographical isolation and separation. But it's clear that there are some differences across locations, and historically this is potentially due to some different patterns of colonial settlement, for example in South Australia, whereas others have, the rationale for others is perhaps less clear. But these differences are increasingly coming to the fore, I think, as more work is undertaken across different locations. A second factor behind this growth and interest in sociophonetic work has been a growing interest in the social dimensions of change within the phonetic properties of English spoken in Australia. This work is focused on testing the extent to which observed changes are supportive or otherwise of more general models of phonological change. So, for example, looking at system-level factors such as chain shifting. But of course, the social trajectories through which a change progresses are central to many of those models. So to this end, an increasing number of projects have undertaken apparent and real-time comparisons, in the latter case showing change occurring even over quite short timeframes, on areas of the phonology such as reversal of the short front vowel raising, which was previously noted for Australian English, trap raising in prenasal consonant environments, goose fronting, glottling of T, etc., etc. And I'd really like to highlight in particular the stream of papers emerging over the last couple of decades from colleagues at Macquarie University, and more recently from the ANU Sydney Speaks project that we heard about earlier, that sheds a lot of light on these trajectories of change and is doing a really great job. So as a result, there are now significant sociophonetic research projects happening across most urban centres in Australia. Brisbane, where I am right now, being a very, very conspicuous gap in my own mind. These are generating new and in many cases publicly available speech corpora to supplement some of the invaluable historical material that has been digitized, such as the Mitchell and Delbridge recordings. This work is focusing on a broader set of phonological variables across a wider range of speech styles and contexts than was previously the case, and is beginning to explore the heavily under-researched role of identity and ethnicity in relation to phonetic variability in Australia. So my own contribution to this, alongside my co-investigators Paul Fowkes, Simon Gonzalez, Nathaniel Mitchell, and with funding from the Australian Research Council, has been a study of sociophonetic variation in English spoken in Perth, the principal urban concentration in the vast state of Western Australia, located about as far away as possible from the other large metropolitan centres. So for example, Perth is located between 3,000 and 4,000 kilometres west of Sydney, depending on how you make that calculation. But of course, despite that location, it's a city that has strong social, cultural, and identity ties to those other urban centres in the country and to the nation as a whole. So this project has been based on an acoustic analysis of the properties of unscripted conversations by pairs of young adult same-sex speakers, addressing the fact that there's very little acoustic phonetic analysis previously on natural conversations generated by English speakers in Australia. We now have a large corpus of material from 148 speakers designed to permit large-scale acoustic phonetic analysis. We're going to be working on this corpus for a long time, for the rest of our productive lives, I suspect, and looking at a wide range of variables. But to date, a lot of our focus has been on vowel realizations, using a conventional lexical set analysis of vowel categories, and also we focused a little bit on consonants, looking in particular at variation in T and in L vocalization. I'm not going to say anything about L today, though. We've been looking in particular at a hand-corrected subset of 40 speakers from our corpus, balanced for speaker sex and neighbourhood classification. This latter classification helps us look at whether neighbourhoods classified as high SES map to particular patterns of realisation, in line with anecdotal accounts from within the speech community. We're looking at conversational speech, so what we're finding is that the overall configuration of the vowel space is a bit different to previous accounts of the acoustic properties of Australian English that tend to be based on isolated word tokens. So we're finding greater compression overall of the vowel categories and greater overlap between them, which paints a somewhat different visual image of the vowel space for this variety. But in general, it's fair to say that the relative layout of the vowel space aligns pretty well to other accounts of Australian English varieties, thereby providing some reinforcement of the substantial homogeneity of Australian English vowels across vast distances. But while speakers from Perth do in general sound very much like speakers from other Australian cities, our findings also reveal some features differentiating our speakers from accounts of other locations. So for example, we find a very low frequency of monophthongal realizations of the near lexical set. This is something which people have talked about as being perhaps a distinctive feature of Perth speakers, but it certainly is borne out within our data. We find considerable fronting of the foot vowel. We find reduced to diphthong trajectories overall. This is potentially a function of conversational style, but it's interestingly a feature that's also reported by Andy Butcher for isolated word tokens from his speakers in South Australia. And interestingly, in our data, we find particularly reduced realizations of the goat diphthong, contrary to other varieties, as we saw earlier in Catherine's talk. And in our word final T, in our T data, what we find in word final T in phrase final position, we see a very high prevalence of unreleased tokens with or without secondary glottalization, and a very low frequency of released or fricated tokens, which is quite contrasted with some other locations, particularly Melbourne, for example, where these released or fricated tokens appear to be much more prevalent. We also find some evidence of socially structured variation, most notably gender differences, with female speakers generating greater degrees of fronting of the goose vowel, larger diphthong trajectories for choice and near, and a greater frequency of use of glottal realizations of word final intervocalic T, especially in the lower SES neighborhoods. There are also some interesting cases where what appears to be at first glance a feature attached to a particular category of speaker, it turns out on further analysis to be an individual characteristic. So for example, we originally started thinking that fricated word medial T was something which was attributed to female speakers from a particular type of neighborhood. But on closer investigation, this turned out to be attributable to a single female speaker, thereby emphasizing the importance of drilling down to compare individual speakers and work of this sort. Since our project is amongst the first on English in Australia to be focused on conversational speech style, we've also had to spend quite a bit of time dealing with some tricky methodological issues associated with that sort of material, many of which are equally applicable to work on conversational speech across other varieties of English and other languages. There's no easy solution to these, but it's really important to address them in undertaking work of this sort. So one of these is the extent to which it's safe to rely on automatic segmentation for this sort of detailed phonetic investigation. Forced alignment and automatic segmentation is pretty good these days, but there are a lot of contexts where accurate alignment can be difficult to achieve, especially in conversational speech. So for example, in our analysis of T, what we found was that the aligner and the segmentation algorithm was just really struggling to find where the T's were within the connected speech style that we had. And many were simply being defaulted to a standard minimum 30 millisecond segment somewhere more or less where the T was expected to occur, but all of these needed hand correction, and this is why we focused on a subset of manually corrected recordings, just to make sure that we're picking up issues of that sort. So this trade-off of time and scale is a perennial challenge for sociophonetics researchers, especially given the attraction of ever larger corpora. But it's fair to say that for a lot of fine-grained phonetic analysis and for comparative purposes, I think you need to be pretty sure that the segmentation is as accurate as it can be. Secondly, we've encountered some issues around the sorts of samples of material we've been obtaining. So not surprisingly, we found a variable volume of tokens across lexical sets, including some quite low ones. So we wanted to get lots of tokens of the near vowel because that was something we were particularly interested in looking at. But near, it actually is pretty low frequency in our conversational material. We also encountered quite a bit of lexical skewing, and what I mean is cases where specific lexical items dominated the realization of particular categories. So for example, by far the most frequent realization of the square lexical set for us was yeah, where people go yeah in their conversational material, especially for some speakers. Likewise, for a couple of speakers, the most frequent token exponent of the trap vowel was man, as in "ah, man." Obviously, something which occurs very commonly within a conversational interaction. But the question is, when that becomes the most frequent token for that particular lexical set, what do you do about that? Is that a problem or not? We found the same thing with consonantal variables. So, for example, for word medial T, intervocalic T, by far the most common item was pretty, as in pretty cool, which was that combination was actually a highly frequent combination within our conversations across all of our speakers. Now it's possible to handle some of these skewing issues by simply excluding the problematic items, but this obviously reduces the sample size. And it's not a theoretically neutral thing to do, given the high frequency of these items and the role that's attributed in theory to frequency, to item frequency. And the same applies with respect to the inclusion or exclusion of grammatical words. These are often excluded from studies of phonological variation and change. But again, this isn't a neutral decision, given they have very high frequency within natural conversational speech. And a third question for us in working with this sort of material is the extent to which we treat conversational the conversational style as a uniform thing. So conversational speech is often in phonetic studies juxtaposed to other types of speech styles, so read sentences or isolated words or whatever. But it's really clear, it would be no surprise to anybody if we say that it's not that simple. And it's pretty clear within our conversational material that what we have is a range of different types of discourse, ranging through periods of time where we have more or less phatic banter going on between the speakers, other times when there's very much a kind of storytelling mode going on, other times when there's information being passed between two speakers in a kind of equal measure. And so there's a range of different sub-styles going on within our material. And I think it's important for us as we take this work forward to really try to unpack that a little bit, to not simply assume that this is a kind of uniform style that we're dealing with. Okay, I'll stop here for now, but I would just reiterate what's been said before, that this is a really exciting time to be doing sociophonetics in Australia. There are a number of large-scale data sets of contemporary Australian varieties of English, and a number of new corpora are currently on the drawing board. Historical material is now easily accessible to investigate change and progress. And there's a growing community of researchers focused on fine-grained social indexical phonetic detail and addressing the challenges of working with large-scale corpora. Issues for the future are to do with drilling down to identify the relevant social dimensions across which variability is structured in a particular location, much as James has indicated in his talk before. And in doing so, not assuming that what applies in one city or even in one part of one city will necessarily apply elsewhere. Second, we need to really look harder at what will be the most informative forms of acoustic analysis, in particular looking at the vowel dynamics as opposed to steady states, which is tended to predominate in work to date. And thirdly, broadening out the focus from vowels to a much broader set of consonantal and prosodic variables. So, for example, working on speech timing, speech rhythm, intonation, and voice quality. And I'll just stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gerry. Thank you very much. So we are going to be doing Q&A now. So if I could please ask the panelists to switch on your video cameras now. Thank you. So we have 4 questions. I think we will have time for more or less 4 questions. And there are a few comments and notes on the chat which we can engage with later. So the first question is by Felicity Cox. Hello, Felicity. And it's a question for Catherine Travers. So I'll read out the question now. She says, results for fleas suggest young Chinese Australians display prestigious variation. I agree. You suggest this is a more progressive form at the leading edge of change. If you had compared fleas from different status groups in the older group, you would see similar variation in prestige. The challenge is to differentiate between progress and prestige. Great data. Is there anything you would like to say to that, Catherine?
I will unmute. Thanks. Thanks, Felicity, for that question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We do indeed see, when we look at class differences in the older data, we do find quite sharp differentiation. And in fact, in the contemporary data, we find that there's much less differentiation in class. And so the Chinese realizations seem to be more similar to what used to be middle class orientation, middle class realizations, and where the whole sort of community has shifted. I think we would say that the fact that they're at the leading edge of the change is in part an epiphenomenon of the fact that the change is moving in the direction towards the middle class and the Chinese are orienting towards middle class. And so because of that, they end up being situated at the edge of the change. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way. That is the case for the Chinese group. For ER, what I didn't talk about is, in fact, when we chart how the change has spread from an ethno-electoral variant to across the community, we find that initially the first people who seem to take it up are lower working class Australian women in the next generation. So in this case, it goes from what is an ethno-electoral feature, spreads to lower class women, and then spreads across the community. So the change could go in either direction. And the role of ethnic groups in that, I think, will be partly related to where they sit in the social, where they're orienting in terms of the social network. That's what I would say. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much. So the next question is for John Mansfield. It is by a question by Alice Gaby. Hello, Alice, and thanks for your question. So she asks, are people conscious of the association between K forms and oldsplaining? Is this commented on?
Thanks, Alice. That's an excellent question. And actually, this is something I would need to talk to people more about this. Because I've many times, so there was a long period where I was just trying to work out what these K verb forms were doing. And I guess because of my kind of the tradition of linguistic description, I was biased towards looking for some kind of referential difference or some kind of aspectual difference or something. So I was really barking up the tree for a long time, barking up the wrong tree for a long time. And that meant that the questions I were asking were wrong. And I was probably misunderstanding people's explanations. I think the closest I ever got was someone once told me, when you use the K form, it's like you're saying to someone, you can see it. And I think their use of the modal can there is probably a bit different from standard English. It's like it's something to do with perception and access to something. But with regards to how it may be related to social identities and demographics, I've never actually talked to people about this, but it would be a good thing to ask people. Oh, sorry, I've almost forgotten an important point. Sorry, people have linked it to, so in Murunpata, people talk about light ways of speaking and heavy ways of speaking. And actually people have told me that using the K form could be more heavy, and heavy way of speaking is in turn actually more associated with older people. So there was some hints there in people telling me about this, like heavy versus light way of speaking. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Don't you love hearing an academic say the questions I was asking were wrong? How special is that? Because a lot of the times that makes you think about things differently. Thank you so much. So there's another question, and this one's not directed to anyone in particular. It's a more general question. So maybe if you show your hand, if you'd like to contribute, then I can nominate whoever is interested in taking it up. So this one says, I'm interested to hear what the panel think are some unexplored areas of LVC research in Australia. I reckon research on English in Pacifica communities and Anglo-English north of the Tropic of Capricorn would be thumbs up. So what do you think of some unexplored areas? Would anyone like to comment on that at all? I think James was making a comment on the chat about.
Yeah, can I step in? So yeah, so I think it's really a good question, because Gerry was talking about this notion that there's not a lot of regional variation within Australian English, but actually most of the information we have about Australian English is basically from the large metropolitan regions, primarily in southeastern Australia. So we don't know to what extent this is true, because we haven't really done a lot of the research. So I mentioned in the comments that Adele Gregory, who's currently based at La Trobe, has been looking at Anglo-English in regional Queensland. And so Maria Tabane and Adele and I have put in for a grant to do a larger study in northern Queensland. So that would answer the second part of the question. I also think the Pacifica community would be really interesting to look at. And Miriam Meyerhoff has done some work in Auckland, looking at the effect of Pacifica communities on the English spoken there. So I think these are really good suggestions for areas of future research.
Thank you, James. Would anyone else have anything to say at this stage? Maybe we'll leave it for the end when you, is that you, Gerry?
So I totally agree. I think they're really good questions. Totally agree with what James is saying. Just to think about the situation here in southeast Queensland. I mean, the second language spoken after English is Samoan, and so we have very large Pacifica communities in the city, in the kind of axis between Brisbane and the Gold Coast. There's been no research undertaken there in terms of their the linguistic features that characterize that community and their interactions with other members of the community and with other communities. And so I think there's a huge opportunity for work of that sort to take place. I suspect you'd find similar questions popping up in almost any urban centre you can think of within Australia. So I think there's a huge amount of work to be done, and I mean, I know my work, for example, is just really scratching at the surface of some really very, very interesting questions, and so we need more people to sign up to do this sort of stuff, and I think there's a real rich vein of stuff there to be mined.
Thank you. Yes.
Could I add to that? So that's right. There's all this work going on Australian English and lots of stuff going on in the Pacific. But I think the work going on Australian Indigenous languages too is really worth a really exciting avenue. And Australian linguists have had a very long history of community-based fieldwork, of going out, spending time in the community, really getting to know the dynamics of a community and being able to use that to interpret their results. And there's been a lot of data collection going on over time of different thoughts, of different sorts, but more recently, and partly thanks to the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for the Dynamics of Language, in particular, has been investing a lot of funding in development of large-scale corpora of Australian Indigenous languages and languages across the Pacific. And there's a codal corpus collection going on that has just announced that they now have 46 corpora available. And so this will really open up the way for some really exciting corpus-based and variationist work in Australian Indigenous languages, which I think will really enhance our understanding of the situation of those communities and the change going on in those communities. And the work that John is doing on Aboriginal languages and Celeste is doing on Aboriginal English. Debbie Lokes is also doing some work on Aboriginal English in Victoria. There's lot of interest around there. And I think that's going to be a really exciting avenue to watch in the future.
Thank you, Catherine. So that sort of relates to another question, which I think will be our last question today. And this one is about what we think is the unique contribution of Australian sociolinguistics to the field, and how this is fundamentally different from sociolinguistics in other countries. And I just wanted to say, if I may quickly, that this is more, I guess, about my own journey, my academic journey, from being a student in Argentina to being a student in the States to being a student in Australia to finally becoming an academic in Australia. And I think what Catherine is saying is exactly the way I've always seen it, which is that if anything, descriptive linguistics has always been very committed to working with community, with really embedding their work in the reality of whatever community the academics work in. And I think that sort of influenced LVC in Australia in a really exciting way. And I also would like to acknowledge the work of Michael Klein, which James Walker mentioned earlier, which is in a very interesting way also making, influencing what we're doing today. So I think one of the ways that sociolinguistics research in Australia is different is that we are speaking to our predecessors and people who have done work not only in LVC, like Barbara Horvath, of course, but outside of it as well. So, and that's exciting, because perhaps 7 years ago when we started in 2013, I don't know that I was feeling that way about it. So I feel like for those of us who have been on this journey, this 7-year journey, with the Centre of Excellence, with other grant opportunities that have come our way, I think, it's become quite different. So that's what I would like to contribute to that. If anyone would like to add their 2 cents to that before I leave you with some final reflections.
I'd just like to pick up on something you talked about in your brief presentation, Celeste, about the kind of fieldwork methods, and how you obviously found that actually just the methodology to be a very compelling part of your research on Aboriginal English in Perth. And that goes for a lot of this Indigenous research around Australia and in the wider region, as James has been pointing to. Actually, just the research activity itself. I deliberately kind of mentioned and acknowledged certain individuals today who had been involved in the studies I was talking about, because I wanted to highlight the way that the actual research activity and the relationships that you form as part of it are really a very interesting and beautiful part of it in itself.
Yes, and if I may, again, just a quick comment to that is that I guess when you are working two-way, and especially for me last year, because you are working as a team with someone, in this case, Glenys, in my case, and you know, the people that you were mentioning in your research, there's a point at which the boundaries of, you know, perspectives and everything become a bit blurred, and I did become way more aware of what the research may mean for that community. I have no idea specifically, I can't point out how it will contribute, but I can see how this is important to think about and to engage in this sort of conversation. There was a question asked at the end of Sally Tagliamonte's Abralin event a couple of days ago, and it was about this very issue of, if you wanted to do research in a community where you're clearly an outsider, how would you go about it? And she tackled it really well, and you know, she drew on her own experience. But I think what we can contribute as Australian sociolinguists is maybe, more reflective practice in terms of how we are going about doing the work that we're doing, especially when it's a minority community that you're clearly not a part of. I think we now need to begin to wrap up. So what I will suggest is that we take it in turns to give a final reflection, and we will reverse the way that we'll do this now. So starting with Gerry and finishing with Catherine, please. Thank you. So Gerry.
Okay, so just a couple of thoughts to finish with. I also think it's very instructive to look at the Australian census, because it's replete with wonderful information. But one thing you find there is that across the whole nation, a third of the population is born overseas. 28% of households are multilingual, and those numbers rise quite significantly in some of the urban centres. So Melbourne, for example, 40% of the population is born overseas. 38% of households are multilingual. And you get similar figures in Sydney and Brisbane. And so I think for me, there's a really interesting question is from the point of view of sociophonetics, what is happening within those multilingual households? How is phonetic variability being structured in relation to the really fascinating multilingual context that those households are generating? And how does that then impact on the way in which those speakers interact and deploy phonetic resources in their other interactions in the broader community? So I think there's a huge, really interesting set of questions to be looked at there. And I think Australia has, given those kind of population characteristics, I think Australia has a really great opportunity to make a fantastic contribution from that point of view. And I think the second point I'd make is that in a country which is not the place of birth of so many people, I think how you sound at first encounter with somebody else, and how that is received is really very important. It's very important in all sorts of ways. But we know relatively little, I think, on the whole, about how phonetic variability is perceptually evaluated by Australians, by the complex mix of people that Australians are. We know relatively little around prestige clients, both overt and covert. And whilst we have glimpses of the ideologies that sit behind aspects of the way in which phonetic variability is received, there's relatively little systematic analysis of that. And I think increasingly that's an area of research that I think is becoming quite urgent within Australia. I think we need to understand more how this works, because I think it's really a pretty routine part of a lot of people's lives at the moment. Well, in general, but particularly right now.
Thank you, Gerry. James, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Celeste. I'm really excited to see the range of research that's happening, not only in the panel here today, but other people that are doing research in this area. And I would also echo Gerry's sentiment that we really need a larger empirical base to understand a lot of what's happening as Australia develops into this multicultural, multi-ethnic society. I think traditionally in Australian linguistics there's been a focus, understandably, on documenting the Indigenous languages because many of them have been dying out, and there's a focus on revitalization. But I also think that we need to take into account the fact that languages are living entities, and I'm really heartened to see that a lot of people who are working in this traditional area are starting to take into consideration the notion of variation, that languages are not these static things that you can record in a grammar book. They're living entities that are used by speakers. And so I think that variationist research can contribute quite a lot to this tradition.
Thank you. I absolutely loved languages are living entities. That should be put on a mug or a t-shirt somewhere. So John, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. So I think in the coming years, it's very exciting. This often talked about kind of turn towards Asia, seeing Australia as part of an Asia Pacific region, as opposed to seeing it as a colonial offshoot of England. I'd like to highlight the fantastic innovative journal, Asia Pacific Language Variation, which has been going for a few years now and is just brimming with excellent empirical studies from the region, including Australia, but also Asia Pacific generally. And so this touches on a lot of things that people have talked about today, and indeed even touches on Australian English, of course, because Chinese Australian English and other Australian and other Asian Australian Englishes, are very exciting new varieties that we all encounter every day in our cities. So yeah, I think that's an interesting way that some of these threads have been drawn together. Thank you.
Thank you. Catherine, would you like to go next?
Yes. So I would say that I think it's good to think we're doing all this great linguistics work now, and I think it's good to bear in mind the social implications of that and the social import of that. Australia is a highly diverse country. It always has been, with our diversity of Indigenous populations, and now with increasing migration, we're seeing a different kind of diversity arising. And we know, and we're seeing more sadly in the current day, that this can give rise also to negative outcomes and quite a lot of racism. And we know also that linguistic stereotyping is a real issue and very problematic and is affecting people's lives on a very large scale. So I think the work that we're doing, looking at variation across different ways of speaking in Australia and highlighting the value and the naturalness of that variation, can hopefully go some way to try to combat that linguistic stereotyping and the racism that can come from that.
Thank you. So as you can see, we have so much work still, there's so much work still to be done. And hopefully the next generations will be thinking up ways to tackle all the issues. I also wanted to acknowledge the work of James Stanford, who has inspired and motivated a lot of the research that we have been conducting here in the last couple of years. That's all we have time for today. Thank you so much for watching. Take good care of yourselves, and thanks again, Abralin, for making this possible. Goodbye.
Thanks, Celeste.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you, Celeste. Bye-bye.